Gwyr míle maith go léir agus I dosach go bharlam ará go bhfuil manana buíocht de Herman as up an fuarthas chun seachtain seo aniu chun Kindliv. Thank you very much, and at the very outset I just want to congratulate Herman for organising this conference and giving me the opportunity to speak. And Herman, at the risk of stealing some of your lines, I think this is the first time a political party has been established where people paid to come in, so it's a very good job. And again, at the risk of sounding like a mutual admiration society, I'm delighted to be in the presence of Ray Kinsella and the other speakers. Myself and Ray have spoken at a number of meetings, and at a very early stage, I think we were very much voices in the wilderness, but it seems to be, things seems to be changing. And last night I was at a meeting in Dublin, again on the same subject, and there was only standing room. So obviously, whereas the opinion polls might show it, there's certainly interest in this area. I want to say that I'm speaking here, as Ray did, as an independent. I, for nearly 40 years, have worked for the Irish government, a big organisation, and I greatly value the ability to say what I think now, not what I'm paid to say. So when you see people off spokesmen, they're often paid. The only advice I'd say is be true to yourself, even if it's unpopular, and it doesn't make you some friends in certain places. I think the foundation of this party and the general discussions which are taking place at long last about our nature of our relationship with the European Union are very, very badly needed. You know, I often listen to Irish politicians talk about the British media and say it's terrible the way they write about the European Union, but the suffocating uniformity of Irish media mainstream coverage in Europe. And in some of the mainstream papers here in the Republic, there is an editorial policy. So even if the individual journalist was quite interested in what you're saying and what you, and maybe even had some sympathy for it, they're unlikely to get a proper hearing in the paper. And they will tell you that privately, that essentially the paper has a policy, and if you don't fit in with the policy, then you don't, it doesn't get in. Now, and anyone who's challenging the power of the European Union, you've got to realise the kind of forces that are against you in Ireland. There's a huge EU industry in Ireland, and a lot of it is being supported by taxpayers' money. A number of academics who come out and produce papers in Europe, they're all being funded by organisations, by funding from Europe. Now, there really isn't any funding from Europe. They're being funded by Irish taxpayers. And I always have a smile when I hear we get funding from Europe. Europe uses member states' funds, and there are people, often in discussions I often saw when academic and other people, I say, would you declare whether you've ever got a grant from Europe? Because I'm not saying that doesn't make your point valid, but I think it's a pertinent fact that you've had a material advantage from your pro-European stance. Now, I remember when I was still in the civil service, and I made a suggestion once at a meeting, which almost got me lynched. My view was that anybody who negotiates with the European Union, the Irish government side, should be statutorily barred from taking a job at the European Union for at least 5 years. Because there's such an obvious conflict of interest. The number of politicians and officials who regularly slip from Ireland into European institutions and back again, and yet how often the interests of Brussels and the interests of Dublin are not the same. So how can you be sure that the person is acting purely in the interests of Ireland if they've got an eye on a job? And the other question I often ask is, with all this Euro enthusiasm, why do we have to pay all these people huge amounts of money? You know, because if somebody moves from a job in Dublin to a job in Brussels, they massively improve their financial circumstances. If people believe in this European business, why do we have to do, as Bevan said about the doctors in the NHS, why do we have to stuff their mouths with gold? Why don't they do it out of conviction? Why do we have to make special arrangements for children of EU officials? Why do they charge a special tax rate and various things like that? And to be honest with you, that's a form of payola. That's corrupting the whole... So if you're setting out to confront the Irish settled policy on the European Union, remember there's a lot of very powerful vested interests out there who are not going to give you a fair shake and are going to feel threatened by what you say. And in fact, inside government apparatus, I was always struck at how sensitive they were to criticism of Europe. Given the opinion polls, you would imagine that the pro-European element in Ireland would be very, very confident and be quite delighted to have discussions. And yet when you have somebody like Tony Coughlin or Patricia McKenna or Raymond Crotty starting asking for fairness in referenda, it causes a huge reaction, a reaction that's never written about, but there's almost a hyper reaction against it, which makes me feel all the time that the actual basis on which the pro-European feeling is sitting isn't that strong after all. Now, the general drift of pro-European propaganda, or a sort of a sacred cow syndrome that you cannot question Europe, does have detrimental effects on Ireland, and it's partly the reason why we've got into such a mess on Brexit. Now, it was Brexit which got me to start writing, because I spent my time, vast majority of my time in the north, and talking to some of the negotiators who were involved in Brexit. It was quite clear that they had no idea of the painstaking efforts by huge elements, civic society, governments and all, to put together a peace process in Ireland. Because when I suggested that, maybe we should be very sensitive to Britain because we rely on them to maintain the Good Friday Agreement, and I was told that that wasn't the situation, that was one of the dinosaurs, that in fact our relations with Britain were not of that value. Our future lay in Brussels. And I was also told, which I was never told before, is no matter what the outcome of the Brexit negotiations, Ireland was going to be on Team EU. Now, I had never heard of negotiations where we went in and we had no bottom line. The bottom line was we were going in with Europe. And that, I think, is from a generation, several generations of pro-EU propaganda. So when the Cameron negotiations came up, and it was quite obvious that Brexit represented a threat to Ireland if it went through, Ireland did not help in getting any decent reforms. Cameron was left completely with nothing really to go onto the referendum. In fact, in the referendum itself, the Cameron reforms weren't even mentioned. And Ireland, and again arguing inside, said, why don't we do this? He said, well, look, Ireland and Britain are close together. There's always a suspicion in Brussels that we might be a bit soft. So we've got to be one of those people who are determined to maintain the integrity of the union's legal order, something that you will hear all the way through. And of course, the experts who had all come in recently all said that there's no possibility of Brexit being carried. And if it's carried, the British government will ignore it, and various things like that. So, coming from a scientific background, Albert Einstein said the definition of insanity is trying the same experiment over and over again and expecting a different result. We're doing exactly the same thing as we did with the Cameron renegotiations. We're not taking our national interests into consideration. We're being subservient to Brussels. And after the Brexit negotiations, there's another area where, because of my connections with the North, is the Good Friday Agreement has clauses in it for bilateral consultations on all matters between Ireland and Britain. But we refused to use the Good Friday Agreement to talk to the British. We said we can't talk to the British, it's going to go through Brussels. Even though we were in a much different situation than anyone else. We should have put our hands up immediately and said, we are a special case. We need a special arrangement with Britain. We need a special arrangement with Europe. But no, it was decided that we would be as strongly European as the strongest Europeans. And it just made absolutely no sense. And it wasn't questioned enough. Our sole policy since that period has been to say the British have to ignore Brexit, or else they've got to agree to a Brexit which is so mild that it makes no difference. Now, if we had had a referendum here, and if we had decided on some areas, and the British were telling us what to do, we'd go mad, and we'd be rightly so. But it doesn't seem to dawn on them that that doing this and telling a country how to behave is not really what it's all about. And I agree with Ray, the other Ray, about the nature of the European Union. When I started working first, the European Union officials were probably very friends. They were actually very, very helpful. They were supportive of government. Then when I went to Canada, you come off against a completely different animal altogether, where you were just a subsidiary part. And a good example of that was during the height of the crisis, the Irish government, through the embassy in Ottawa, asked the Canadian government to open up Canadian immigration to young Irish people, because there wasn't enough jobs in this country at the time. The only way we could help. And the Canadian government, who had an Irish-Canadian minister by the name of Jason Kenney, agreed to give 10,000 visas, 2-year visas to Irish people. When the European Union heard about this, they said, well, what about the rest? Poland's only 80, the UK in total gets 5,000, but Ireland is way out of line, Ireland and France. And I remember the Canadian immigration minister said, I gave that to Ireland because my family were starved out of Roscommon in the 1840s, and it was a way of paying some ancestral debt back. He said, if the European Union wanted special visas, then that's the end of the programme. But it was this idea that anything we got was theirs, and they could do it. And same with Irish organisations. I wanted a list of every Irish organisation in Canada to be listed under the European Union. Now, people out in Newfoundland wouldn't know what you were talking about, but these people wanted to take anything that they could from the member states, and it was a totally different relationship. The relationship in the 80s and the 90s was one of great cooperation, some of your best friends in it. But by the time the various treaties had worked through and the European Union people, especially in third countries, felt that they were the federal ones and we were the equivalent of the county councils. And that was very, very difficult to taste. But one of the arguments I've been saying all the time is that circumstances change. And you've always got to decide where the balance of advantage lies. And my own belief now is that the balance of advantage has moved very heavily away from our membership of the European Union. Simply because if you look at all of the recent initiatives from Europe, they're almost all against our interests. I can't think of an area where suddenly Europe took over our interests and ran with it. Whether it's in the corporate taxation area, whether it's the ECB forcing our banks to sell off large swathes of the housing market to vulture funds, even on telling us when we should have summertime and wintertime. It's almost a stage where we're literally losing the last bit of sovereignty. And it always strikes me as amazing that I regularly get criticised for being unpatriotic, for trying to maintain our sovereignty, while the people who are trying to sell it are trying to wrap the green flag around it. There's a real rich irony here that the Irish government has decided to get into alliance with some of the most reactionary people in Britain, including the House of Lords, to thwart democracy. Now, it was only 100 years ago when the House of Lords was trying to thwart Irish democracy. So now we're working with the Irish democracy. And then I don't want to keep rabbiting on, but if you look at the situation, there is again a tendency in government to try and play down anything that doesn't reflect well in the European Union. And it took me a long time when I was writing a column at the Sunday Business Post to actually find out, what do we pay Europe? What's the financial arrangements? And I asked several times, and I got answers which were impenetrable. And I know that as a civil servant, that means you're not answering the question. But eventually, through FOI, through the Freedom of Information Act, and through some of the other journalists, we managed to find out that this year, Ireland will probably pay much more than we thought. The net contribution will be close to €1 billion. We're going to get more than €1 billion out than we're getting in. The figures work out. Our contribution this year is going to be about 2.7 billion, and what we're going to get is 1.7 billion back. So I love people. I love people talking about Brussels largesse and things like that. And we're still paying massively for the bailout. So there's a huge burden on Ireland. Back. But to be quite honest, given the fact that we are a net contributor, that gives us a little more freedom than we would have had before. And of course, there's the effect on our fishing and our industry that Brexit is going to have. Now again, because I've worked in government, I tend to go to the government for figures. I tried to find out what was the percentage of fish taken in Irish waters by Irish boats. And the answers were completely, again, incomprehensible. And then the British, I asked them, and they said, oh yeah, it's somewhere between 25 and 30%. They could give it to me in a 5-minute phone call, which is more than 10% below what the British are complaining about. But after Brexit and the exclusion of foreign boats from British waters, there's only one other place they can come, and that's us. So, and the fact that if you look at our fishing industry, the fishing catches have been going down all the time. So even what we're talking about is only a fraction of what a proper area would actually give. And remember, 90% of our territorial economic zone is maritime. So the sea should be much more important to us than other areas. But it's an area, again, where we have given far too much away to Britain. Now, Ray Kinsella spoke about, never place your faith in princes, because we saw that during the bailout talks. John Major has written an autobiography. Whenever you think about John Major, he has some very good things to write about the European Council. And he said the humiliation of some of the small countries is incredible at the European Council. He said this was during Jacques Delors' time, and Jacques Delors was such a powerful figure that if he set on anybody, he would, they didn't want to take his wrath. But he said what was particularly cruel and hard to watch was when one small country was being kicked around by the Commission, all the other small countries came behind the Commission as a way of ingratiating themselves in it. He said he would love to have got it on TV. And as the Greek Foreign Minister described Ireland as the model prisoner. And the one thing I want to talk, because it's slightly obsessive on it, because of the border. My family is a north-south family of grandchildren in Belfast, son in Belfast, my family in Tyrone, family in Derry. So the border is a big issue for me, to be quite honest. And again, I thought the Irish government went on the wrong track here. Because however much, and I would love to see my country united, the bailout, the backstop is inoperable. It can't be delivered. There's not, and sometimes I think people don't listen or read in TV. There was a bill that passed through the House of Commons. It was the Customs Bill. And one of the clauses, one of the amendments was that it outlawed any different customs arrangements between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Anything. It didn't even have one person opposing it. Now, it didn't even get enough for a division. And yet, the Irish government are pushing ahead. The other thing I'd say is that under the Good Friday Agreement, we said that we would give parity of esteem to both communities in the north, and we were negotiating that we meant it. So I'm thoroughly against a border on the island of Ireland, but I don't want to impose a border in the Irish Sea either to people who would feel threatened by that, because in the end, we need reconciliation, and we're not getting reconciliation by attacking and sort of saying we want to cut people off. And there's just no way that the British government are going to agree to a border in the Irish Sea. In 1924, and I read a lot of the state papers, the Irish government under William Cosgrave decided to introduce a customs border in Ireland. And the whole argument was, this will scare the British into having a border in the Irish Sea. It didn't work then, and it's not going to work now. And it's exactly the same arguments. And it's eerie reading the same discussions in it. No matter how much, we long to see, our country coming together. We are huge beneficiaries of our bilateral relations with the British. There are over 500,000 Irish-born people on the island of Britain. And you know what the nearest other EU country has? 17,000 in Spain. 1/35 of the number of people in the island of Britain. There are more people in Toronto than there are in France and Germany put together. That shows you the whole cultural orientation of the Irish people. The next time a crisis comes in Ireland, and crisis will come, if we have managed to mess up the common travel area, people without a job are not going to fly off to Munich or Hamburg. Maybe a few of the kind of top graduates might, but the average person is going to be looking for a job in Britain, Australia, Canada, the United States. We have to, our policy's got to reflect that. And one thing we can't do is we can't destroy the common travel area. Now, I've spoken in Westminster in a few places, and the amount of antagonism that's building up against Ireland is wrong, because even if the Taoiseach was misquoted about closing the airspace to the British airplanes, it was pure madness. You know, who would be the major beneficiary, or the major sufferer, if British airspace was closed? We couldn't even go to the continent. You know, you get the impression there's a certain infantile element in it there who's not thinking things through. And of course, we export. People say, yeah, we export only 15% of our goods to Britain, which is true. That's 15% by value, 30% by volume. But over 90% of all the goods leaving Ireland to go abroad travels through Britain. It goes through, an awful lot of it goes through on the lorries over the land bridge. And again, whereas we may get a deal, and I hope we will get a deal to go through there, why would you endanger that? Why would you be so antagonistic to the country that you need to do a deal with in the end? And it just wasn't. Listen, I won't keep rabbiting on. I know I'm gone far too long as it is. Herman's throwing glances at me there, but I just want to say that I welcome the creation of this party. I remember when the Labour Party was Eurosceptic. I remember when Sinn Féin were Eurosceptic. So there's probably a place on it there. But I think the future will depend. Certainly in the immediate term, I think the future will depend on how the Brexit negotiations come out. If, as I fear, we're not going to do particularly well on this and we will be screwed by the European Union in the end, then obviously that would be a major blow for people who are pro-European. But I think overall, as Ray Kinsella said, Europe is changing and the people are falling out of love with Europe. You just look at every election result, except the French, which was a particular choice between Marine Le Pen and Macron, and in that case, people rallied to Macron rather than Marine Le Pen. But everywhere people are voting against it. The fact that we've kind of wrapped Brexit up in an orange-green kind of argument has probably postponed that a little in Ireland. But I think the scales will fall off, as it's fallen off everywhere, as the nature of this European Union and its desire to create a super-state and to project its power abroad. You would imagine after what the mess-up that was done in Libya, that the Europeans would not be keen on projecting abroad. President Obama said the biggest mistake of his foreign policy was to listen to the Europeans about Libya, and he said he'd never do it again. So why are these countries so anxious to start going around the world and injecting military power and destroying societies? And I think it's totally anathema to what our founding fathers did and what the general aspirations of our people are.